Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, everyone, and maybe good afternoon to the panelists and participants from New York and Brazil. Today, the Doha International Family Institute, a member of Qatar Foundation for Education, Science, and Community Development, is commemorating the International Day of Families. By this remarkable panel discussion on technology and familial relationships during COVID-19, where we will try to explore and investigate how COVID-19 accelerated the widespread use of technology, and more importantly, how this life digitalization affected familial relationships. Let me start by Dr. Sharifa Nu'man Al-Amadi, DFE Executive Director, to commence our commemoration by opening remarks.
Thank you, Ahmed. Esteemed speaker and participants, good evening and welcome to the Doha International Family Institution celebration of the International Day of Families. Building on the theme of the 59th session of the Commission for Social Development, Socially Just Transition towards Sustainable Development, the role of digital technology on social development and well-being, all the 2021 observance of the International Day of Family focus on the impact of a new technology on the well-being of families. Today, as we celebrate the International Day of Families, we consider the impact of technology on family relationships, especially in a time where the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic has enhanced the use of technology in our daily work, our children's education, and our daily family lives. Technology has reshaped our relationship with our extended families, paving the way for us to connect with loved ones we cannot see. It has also allowed us to spend more time with our children and adolescents, especially as organizations around the world have introduced flexible working arrangements and steps towards working from home. However, we must also take into consideration the negative impact, especially as technology blurred the lines between work and family and added into the roles and responsibilities of family members, especially mothers, in addition to the increase in the potential dangers that digital technology plays on children when parents' monitoring is lacking. With that said, I welcome you today to address these issues and highlight the measures taken to support families as well as the challenges faced by families and to exchange experience and lessons learned concerning new evidence and innovation targeted at families so that we may all continue to support families in addressing the many challenges they continue to face. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sharifa, for the opening remarks and for the very important guiding points to commence our discussion. We welcome today our panelists, Dr. Daisy Kozustra, the President of World Family Organization. We have two distinguished scholars from the College of Science and Engineering at Hamad bin Khalifa University, Dr. Rayyan Ali and Dr. Dina Al-Thani. We have with us Francesca Gottschalk, analyst at OECD Department for Education and Skills. And we have Anna Nitu, a former colleague in DFE and currently an early childhood development specialist at UNICEF headquarters. Dr. Daisy, let me start by you, as maybe you are representing one of the solidest family advocacy organizations, WFO, with the main objective to represent families of the world at all levels, to defend their interests and to act with them and for them in front of governments and international community. With this, lofty mission in mind, one of the major challenges highlighted by the work of WFO is related to the new technological developments, particularly the extensive use of digital platforms during the pandemic, which pushed millions of families into vulnerability, especially poor families, with the issue of access to technological infrastructure. This is one part. The other part is that this technology kind of extensive use not only pushed families into vulnerabilities, but also generated maybe coldness and gaps in familial relationships. So, Daisy, what's your take on that?
Good afternoon, everybody. For me from Brazil, it's right after lunch now. First, I would like to thank Diffie to organize this roundtable and this webinar. Very important, especially a little bit later than the 15th of May, what gives us the opportunity to sit down and really so many webinars in that day, it was impossible to assist everything. So you got a very good point to make a little bit later so many people can participate a little bit more. Actually, the World Family Organization, we are 73 years old. We have been one of the first organizations right after the war to be settled in order to help families that have been separated after the war, and also families that had to start their lives again because of the consequences of the Second World War. I was thinking the other day in this team, it seems that we were back there to 1945 or to 1946 because this pandemic is bringing to us again such a mess in everybody's lives that we still have to think, or we will restart again, or we will try to adapt to the new normal. I have been reading a lot and participating a lot in different discussions about the technologies supporting and giving access to families in many ways that before was not thinking about. And I am evaluated how actually we could make this digital divide that it's true in the lives of many families to come together, and how to make governments, especially as I think like OCDE, we focus in the local governments, how they can change their minds in order to bring infrastructure. So this digital divide will be really be to families that are not able to do it right now, that they could access the services. Now, I have been reading a very nice study from McKinsey company. It's a big company of consultancy all over the world, about the difference that we are thinking right now and speaking right now in companies and in industries, in workers and consumers. And everything is being focusing on the individuality. Now, all these four expressions that I just put right now, behind it, there is a family. And if we are thinking about the work, behind the worker, there is a family. And this family, in a different economies, in a different countries, in a different cultures, they will have to adapt if they will be really fit in order to balance work and family life, or even if this digital working right now will not make families to lose jobs, to lose income, and to put families in a deeper vulnerability. When we are talking about consumers, we are talking about families. The consumers are families. Behind each individual consumer, there is a family. And if in the rich countries who has access to new technologies or the technologies available in the countries, it's very easy to think, okay, I cannot go to the supermarket, but I can have a delivery at home. How is families that have no access to that? So how they can supply their necessities without this technology being accessible to them? So I would like very much that governments, and it maybe in our discussion comes a little bit more, to think that gaps in the digital gaps have to be taught in two very extremes. The ones that can and fit, the ones that cannot and are putting in a deeper vulnerability. Maybe I will give this for my introductions and leave the colleagues to make deeper on this thinking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daisy, for this very concise answer to the question. And I will quote from you: behind every customer, there is a family. To shift the discussion maybe to the voice of evidence from Dr. Dina Althani, because aligned with what Daisy just stated, a lot of experts are building their specialities on the technological transformations and digitalization, but few scholars are looking at the social side and the human stories behind. And you are one of them, indeed, looking at the humanization of the digital world. Within this interdisciplinary perspective, and considering the fact that home now, besides the normal functionality of a home, it turned to be an office and a school. So could you tell us how modern day technologies, such as virtual realities, can support children online education during the pandemic? Would this also facilitate or hinder family commitments? Especially because we started with Daisy addressing vulnerability from the poverty perspective, but also with you maybe addressing vulnerability in terms of those families living with the children with disabilities. Floor is yours, Dr. Dina.
Thank you, Ahmed. Actually, I agree that usually technology, when it's introduced to the families, to the consumer, they are usually introduced in a way that is, this is the technology, you have to adapt to it. While it is not this way. It is usually the other way around. The technology designs needs to adapt to the users. And when we look at the user group in a family, we have basically the parents, the children, the adolescent, and the elderly, and the list goes on. And the vulnerability is different from one age group to the other. Basically from the differences between the families in terms of the economical background and the access to technology, and how can they attain these technologies, looking at the difference between the East and the West, the difference between countries who have technologies available and have more access. So these differences and these issues has really came into the surface when the COVID pandemic hit. It created basically a new world. So with the schools and universities shutting down, the new measures came into surface: lockdowns, social distancing, moving educational basically a platform from an in-class one-to-one teaching experience to the children, to the parents being the only teachers at home, and being the one who are responsible of the child accessibility to the technology to reach the educational content. And that's in fact a big disruption that happens to the educational and the family settings. And we as designers of the technology, as you kindly said, it's our role to make sure that we know the technology might be in place, and we know that people have been developed, but how can people adapt to this technology? How can these technologies adapt to people? So basically here where basically my area of expertise lies in. And actually, in my group at Hamad bin Khalifa University, we looked for a few years back on the role of virtual and augmented reality. And you might say, why virtual and augmented reality and what it has to do with technology? We found that actually it attracts children to the material they see and interact with, and the content they interact with in the internet. So why don't we facilitate these new technologies to support their learning and teaching journeys? These projects were actually way before the pandemic, but once the pandemic happened, we thought as a designer, what can we do? How can we support basically parents struggling basically in learning and the disciplines of their children during the lockdown periods? We looked at, we surveyed the challenges, and as you kindly said, me and my team as well work and focus on disability. So we also looked at how can we help parents with children with disability? Usually, the parents with kids with disability will not have these skills, the special education skills, and to support their children. So how can technology support them in this regard? So we looked at number of technologies and how can we amend. We at that point as well, we received a very generous fund from Qatar National Research Fund that allow us to develop an augmented reality platform for children with autism. The idea is to develop a platform that will support them and help them engage in the learning process. From there, we looked at the robotic talkative character. How can I develop a character that replaces a teacher in the learning? Maybe not replacing the teacher at all, but when the teacher is not there, can I provide an alternative way of learning? We've been developing such a platform with centers here in Qatar, which were very cooperative with us. So we had like a cooperative way of designing such a platform with parents and teachers. And the idea is, as I said, is to address a gap that we found in the middle of pandemic that is happening. Now the platform is being used by parents, and we are happy with its outcome. So that's one example, and there might be many with the huge capabilities of technology today: artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, and sensing technologies. There are huge capability, but what's important is for us to design something that meets the need of the groups we design for.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dina. And then, you highlighted a very important point, which is at the core and the heart of DeFi business model, which is research is meant, okay, for academia, but the lofty kind of mission of research is actually to translate this into reality. And you created such platforms to facilitate the lives of families living with children with disability. And that's what we are usually stressing on, transforming research into policy and program outputs in order to have the real impact. Dr. Rayan Ali, your work on both concepts, digital addiction and digital well-being, has been widely acknowledged by research centers, not only in Qatar and the MENA region, but internationally. And this has been featured even in mainstream media. Could you please let us know more about parenting styles and mechanisms in the digital age, especially with this concepts you are using in the literature, gaming disorder and digital addiction becoming more recognized?
Thank you for inviting me. Actually, the gaming disorder is recognized already by the World Health Organization. I think it was recognized in June 2018, so like 2-3 years now. 3 years time is passing, so it is recognized now. And we don't have health services for that. So the disorder is recognized, but we don't really know how to advise about it. And most of the advices are coming from traditional addiction or gambling addiction or online gambling addiction. So people looking at it through the lenses of classic addictive behavior. But what's new about technology that you can actually deliver the interventions through the design itself. That's something really like unprecedented. So in the case of other addictive mediums like cigarette, like other things, you can't really do much. So you can send people SMS, or you can put a label on the packet of cigarette and so on. But in the case of technology, you can deliver those interventions in real time. And not only that, also in an intelligent way. You can customize them, you can tailor them, you can time them, you can get feedback from people about them. And that's a luxury that we never had in intervention and counseling programs. And on the other hand, also the use of technology for things like peer support groups, for example, like families having issues with their children, and they discuss these issues, they try to transfer knowledge. It becomes now more popular. Gaming in particular is addictive. And you could see parents really struggling with detaching their kids from the game there. But I say that technology could be the problem. It could be also part of the solution there. Let me tell you a bit about my background. So actually my background is not psychology. I'm software engineering as a background. So in part, I'm also to be blamed about causing the problem. You see, yes, we design the software in this way to be so attractive, to be so immersive, to catch people's attention. I think we never really talked about the harmful effect of technology in familial relationship. To give you an example, the adolescents started to leave Facebook when they knew their parents are on Facebook. So what does that tell us? It tells us basically Facebook wasn't really designed to allow both parents and children to be in the same platform. It means it wasn't even within the scope that parents could join, and then the kids will create additional account or fictional account and all of that. And we teach that to our students anyway. So the classic software engineering courses and the classic system analysis and design courses, we basically teach our students to go and ask user what they want and the clients what they want. And in most cases, who are the clients? The clients are the clients are the businesses, basically. The client is a bank, the client is a library, the client is a university, but we never really talk about a client within a familial setting. And that actually goes, even our method, even the way we build the technology, to be hugely biased towards what the industry wants. So what the industry wants is basically productivity, attention, revenue. We really don't care that much about whether the software is causing a familiar distraction, is causing our family time to become lower, the quality of time to become lower. It wasn't really in the core of the interest of the technology development so far.
Exactly. And this is commodification. I think terminology is very important here, because the huge enterprises, they care for business, and they leave the human side aside. So I'll go now to Francesca. As you have recently published one of the OECD outstanding reports on impacts of technology use on children, exploring the literature on brain, cognition, and well-being. And I believe you have a short presentation, maybe to give some insights from this report, and at large, exploring the relationships between children and families in the digital age. So the floor is yours, Francesca.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this really interesting webinar. If my slides could be pulled up. Sorry, I seem to be having technical issues, which is the irony that we're sitting here talking about technology.
No, I think maybe if the host behind Mr. Yusuf, if you are able to share the slides of Ms. Francesca.
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I can start just before the slides come up. What I'd like to share with all of you today is a little bit about the work that I've been doing at the OECD in the Center for Educational Research and Innovation. I work on a project called 21st Century Children, where we explore the nature of modern childhood. And two of the areas that we explore the literature, and we've done a policy survey, and we work closely with countries, is we look at digital technologies and children's relationships. So some of the trends currently in children's use of digital technologies is we see across the OECD and outside of the OECD that generally there's a closing of the first digital divide. So this means that children have an increase in access to digital technologies. And we also see that there's been quite a big movement of sort of child empowerment in the digital space. So we see that children are creating content, they're engaged in online civic activities. The internet and the digital environment is a really great opportunity for children to find and express themselves. Oh, excellent. I see they're coming up.
Yeah.
Perfect. So if we just go to the trends slide, please. Next, on the right-hand side, you'll see that although digital access has a number of amazing opportunities, there are also some pitfalls. So for example, just by virtue of being in the digital environment, children will be exposed to risks. This could be cyberbullying, it could be fraud, commercial risks, etc. And we've also seen in a number of countries that increasingly worryingly, we have the second digital divide, which is the gap between children's digital skills and their uses in the digital environment. And then in the middle, we kind of have this gray zone where children are spending more time in the digital environment. Younger children are using digital technologies. As my colleague before me said, children are not using Facebook anymore. They're turning to platforms such as Instagram and TikTok, and probably a number of platforms that I don't know about. Probably many of you don't know about it either. And then there's also a big question of what is the impact of the Internet of Things, the Internet of Toys, artificial intelligence and social robots. So just to give you a snapshot of children's media use, if you could scroll to the next slide, please. This is data from the United Kingdom. They've collected, it's Ofcom that's collected this data, and it's really incredible to see the difference in children's media use by age. So we see in the younger groups that 24% of children have their own tablet, almost half play online games for up to 5 hours a week. Most of them watch TV, and 1% of 3 to 4-year-olds have a social media profile. And we see that as we move from the 5 to 7s, from the 8 to 11s, and the 12 to 15s, more children are doing more diverse things in the digital environment. What's particularly interesting about this data as well is that we see that, for example, in the 8 to 11s, 21% of children have a social media profile. And we know that most social media platforms have a 13+ age policy. So there's something going on here that we really need to get to the root of and see what kind of effects is this having on children? How is it affecting their socialization and their education? And also what this data really shows us is that children are not just playing games, not just watching TV, they're doing a number of different things in the digital environment. And therefore thinking about children's digital engagement solely as screen time is not the most useful metric anymore, when really there's a convergence of the digital and the physical. If we move to the next slide, this sort of reiterates that point where we often hear about people talking about digital natives. You know, young people have grown up in a digital era. They've been exposed to digital technologies for their whole lives. But we really see, I think this slide didn't show so well, but what we see is, what this is trying to show is that children really carry out a number of different activities in the digital sphere, such as looking for news online, watching video clips. And this is really an area that sort of hits home the importance of education systems and of parents, because parents modeling different digital behaviors and parents assisting children using their digital skills to assist their children in the digital environment, this will really have an impact on the benefits that children can reap from going online. If we go to the next one, we see that children learn different digital skills at different levels of education. So in the early years and early childhood and pre-primary, we see that there's the start of a focus on things like operational skills. Can children turn on a computer, open a Word document and type in it, that kind of skill. And then we see there's some learning about critical information, social skills, etc. And we see generally across the education system, by the time children are in primary and secondary school, they're really getting a lot of exposure to learning different digital skills in education. If we go to the next slide, this is some data from the early learning survey at the OECD, and we actually see, and this is not children necessarily using digital tools in an educational context, this is just in general. So when we compare children who've never or hardly ever used digital devices to those who haven't, or who have, excuse me, we see that they actually show a higher level of mental flexibility than children who haven't used digital devices. So this is just one example of how digital tools can actually have a positive association with children's learning. So if we scroll down to, I just want to go very quickly over some parenting in the digital age. In our research, we've looked at some of the different parenting styles and behaviors. So I'd ask you all to look to the right of this chart. We see, for example, phubbing. So that's a portmanteau of phone and snub. So that would be if you're speaking with somebody, or if your child is speaking to you and you're looking at your phone and you're ignoring them, you're snubbing them by being on your phone. This is also called technoference. And this could be associated with different behaviors in childhood, such as acting out, or children trying to get their parents' attention when they're phubbing. And we also see sharenting, which is it's the phenomenon of parents sharing images of their children, videos, information in the digital environment, often without the consent of their children. And sometimes this happens even as early as during pregnancy. So what does this mean for the child's digital footprint? It's really important when engaging in different parenting styles, some of these digital behaviors, to take note of what you as a parent are doing, because children will really mimic, or they will learn from these behaviors. And we know that parental digital behaviors and skill levels are highly correlated with their children's digital skill levels. If we go to the next slide, we know that, as I said before, screen time isn't necessarily the best metric, but as my colleague before said, some parents indeed are concerned about the amount of time their children spend using digital devices. So some parents try to reduce this through limits or bans. And one thing that we've found is that this may actually reduce risks, but this could be at the cost of digital opportunities. So what we actually see is that parents who are really skilled and who are confident in their own digital skills and in their children's digital skills, they tend to take less restrictive approaches. And what parents who encourage their children to take part safely and effectively in the digital environment, they can help children manage the risk and create a safer environment without hindering their agency or learning. So this is really important. And we see that parents who take a more enabling approach tend to be that tends to be a more effective approach for their children. So if we scroll down just to the, thank you, to the key findings slide. So summing up, as I've said, we've seen a big convergence of the digital and offline spaces. Children are playing, socializing, learning all over, whether it's on a phone, a computer, or in person. As I said, screen time is no longer a very useful metric, especially with the development of augmented reality, virtual reality, non-screen-based digital technologies. We see generally that a moderate use of digital tools is correlated with positive social and academic outcomes. As I said, parents' digital skills and habits are correlated with their children's. And so if your child is watching TV or playing a game, so-called co-viewing, which is where you as a parent would engage with your child during these digital activities, or just sit on the couch next to them while they watch TV, that can help children understand the digital content. And lastly, it's incredibly important to balance digital risks with digital opportunities, because the digital environment has both. And children need to be exposed to a certain level of risk in order to build resilience, which is important in terms of their future education and entering the workplace. But we also need to ensure that the digital environment is a safe space where they can really make the most of the opportunities there. So I'm going to stop here. If you'd like more information, if you scroll to the last slide, I have a couple of QR codes if you would like to access the publications we published. And that's the website to my project. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Francesca, for the very interesting presentation indeed, and very important findings, and especially because we do in DeFi research, and we invested in parenting education programs. It is very important to support this research by the evidence you brought related to different types of parenting styles, the helicopter and tiger parenting styles, and how this would work with the digital age, and how to utilize this evidence in designing and developing parenting education programs. So thank you, Francesca. And here we go for Ananito. And I will start by quoting the one of the recent publications you co-authored in UNICEF, Anna, related to COVID-19 trends, promising practices and gaps in remote learning for pre-primary education. So the research started by an interesting statement by that children's first years of life are critical to building a learning foundation that will help them succeed in school and beyond. So from your research, what are the recent emerging trends in this area, and how can we support and provide inputs for the research agenda in general in this regard?
Thank you so much. And I really want I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here. And I already learned so much from the other panelists, so many terms and interesting research. And I'm going to quote you, Francesca, with that fobbing, because I think a lot of my friends and perhaps me and my husband are guilty of fobbing sometimes. So thank you. I learned something today. So with that interesting question, I wanted to start by saying that, as you rightly said, the early years matter. We know in the recent evidence, as the Lancet in 2016 said, early means early. From conception to the moment that the child is born to the moment that they are 3, the brain is forming at an exponential rate. All the connections and the neurons, and we know that actually, if we don't pay attention to those formative years, we are actually going to have a lot of issues later on. So for us during the pandemic, we knew already that more than 250 million children were already at risk of not fulfilling their optimal developmental potential. And what we saw with COVID is that that number significantly increased. And that was a combination of factors. The first one is the unique nature of the pandemic. For the first time, we really saw caregivers as frontline responders of their children's education, health, and care needs. And then we also saw a disruption of services where parents could not get the services that they used to get because of the different restrictions that were put in place. So one of our main concerns was to first make sure that the learning environment was optimal for children. Because I think one misconception that I hear often is that people say, oh, learning begins in pre-primary. No, it's too late. Actually, the brain is forming and learning begins since the moment that the child is in the womb. So what we have to do is to actually make sure that parents receive the support that they need so they can have optimal learning environments at home and nurturing environments. And I want to actually allude to some of the comments that the other panelists made, and it was that during the pandemic, so many parents struggled. They struggle financially, they struggle in terms of balancing their work and life responsibilities, they struggle with mental health issues, and we cannot actually deny that. So a lot of the support that we work to provide children in partnership with governments and partners was actually to come together to create an enabling environment for parents. So one key advocacy strategy for us has been family-friendly policies. This concept that parents need the time, they need the resources, and they need the knowledge to be able to support children. And secondly, to help countries think, how can we redesign the programs that we already have to be able to adapt technologies to reach those parents in moments where we could not have the face-to-face interactions that we knew. So in that paper that you mentioned, one of the key things that we found out is that it was very important to protect that early learning environments, but also even the pre-primary services. Many ministers of education were prioritizing going digital for primary education, secondary education, but many of them were forgetting the pre-primary years. So a lot of what we did was work in actually creating curriculums that are optimal for children when you use digital media. And here to some of the comments from some of the panelists, one key aspect was equity. We do know that a lot of families did not have the same access to technology. So what we found is that those programs that work well have a multi-pronged approach. So what ministers of education that were successful did is that they did have a lot of online content for those parents that had access, but they also paired it with radio spots, with TV shows, and with printed materials that were delivered to those families that did not have access to those resources. And in some countries like El Salvador, for example, they were further and they even created a phone line where they allow parents to call in and problem solve with some facilitators about the challenges that they were facing, if they were not understanding some of the material, or if they were feeling overwhelmed. Another thing that I think that paper tries to highlight is that there's so much that we don't know about the learning outcomes that emerge from the use of technology. And I think that this is a great opportunity for future research. And it's like we were forced to actually pivot very quickly into the use of technology. Some governments try to actually have very good monitoring built into the new design of the programs, but some others were just kind of running as they could. So I think that one key lesson learned is that we need to get better at making sure that when we roll out these digital programs, we have better research, implementation research, to know what is working, what is not working, so we can actually tweak and improve in real time. But also, how are we knowing what are the learning outcomes from the beginning, and we can guide parents in seeing if we are actually achieving those milestones. And the last point that I wanted to make is that because early childhood development is holistic, we know that children need early learning, but they also need health and nutrition and safety and responsive caregiving. And by responsive caregiving is the interactions with the environment, and most importantly, with their parents and their caregivers. Because we know that optimal child development is not going to happen if the parents are not interacting with the children. So one of the things that we saw is that many of our programs actually use telehealth to start delivering home visits to families that were struggling in order to help the caregivers deal with all the stressors that they were experiencing, including the mental health issues that some of them were facing, and then try to see how to promote play and communication with the children at home. So I think that to the point that some of the panelists were saying is that we don't think that technology is necessarily bad, but technology is just a tool that has to actually have some key principles and core values. And we need to ensure that those interactions between the caregivers and the children are at the center of the approach. We know that actually children learn as they play. So we don't want them to be passive learners just being on a screen for 5 hours. If it is mediated content, if the content is quality, and as many were saying, is actually that interaction with the adult that is guiding that interaction with media, it could actually be beneficial to the child. But it is very important that we keep in mind that at the center of everything that we are doing with technology, it has to enable that relationship between the child and the environment, the child and the caregivers, and not replace it. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I think you made a clear point, which is cross-cutting with the many panelists, which is parents are the main caregivers. And I think from this point, we focus maybe more than half of our discussion today on the parent-to-children relationship in this digital age and in the context of COVID-19. Now, I would like to shift the discussion a little bit to start rethinking the theme that we put today in place for this panel discussion, which is impact of digital technology on familial relationships. And if we are to decompose this concept of familial relationship, it is not only related to the parents-children kind of parenting styles and relationship, but we don't want to leave the spousal relationships behind and not talk about, the marital relationships and how this was affected by many aspects during the COVID-19 pandemic. I received a joke today related to Bill Gates. Bill Gates used to go to office every day for 27 years. 1 year only working from home, and he got divorced. So be careful. It is a joke, but at the same time, statistics really affirms the same joke. Recent statistics, for instance, from Ministry of Justice in Kuwait refers to more than 30% of divorce cases were rooted in causes related to digital addiction. So from digital addiction, I would go straight to Dr. Ryan. The floor is yours to give us some insights on familial relationships in the digital age, focusing on this spousal relationship. And if there is a need for a policy response here in this particular area, because a lot of people are thinking this is, a pure kind of internal space, not a matter of policy addressment.
Thank you. It's actually a great question. So if we think about it, we are spending so much time on technology. So if you have, for example, a couple who do not, let's say, follow the same norms there online, this is a big mismatch. So I know, for example, parents who are not the same in terms of their privacy online. One of them is taking a picture of the kids and posting it, and the other one is extremely, they're against that. But that compatibility in the digital habit is, to me, is very important nowadays, and it has to be tested really to see that these two are okay, also compatible in the online world and the cyber world, as well as social space as well online. As you say, nowadays, I mean, the pandemic revealed a lot of these mismatches, and also, in a way, I mean, the reason for that can be more fundamental, but the use of technology can bring it to the service sometimes, or the presence online can bring it to the service sometimes. The impact of technology on familial relation might not be primary, so it could be really, there could be a lot of underlying issues anyway, and then the technology triggered that. But I have seen, and I have heard, and we have interviewed people who had court cases for things which were not like 20 years ago. For example, the husband or the wife, they were having second life. So basically having an avatar and having a second character and having their own stories there and presenting a totally fictional character. So how we would view that, you see. So it presents a challenge now, whether what is the self is. So do we have the actual self in real life, and we have an alternative self online, and we have a fictional character there? So these are new phenomena. We really don't have much policies for them. And it may introduce an interesting debate, even from legal perspective, divorce perspective. They do really introduce those kind of challenges there. Now, if we move to children, and besides the example I gave about the privacy of children and posting picture of children and so on, it does really look like literacy about the online world is one of the issues for the familial problems. So I know families, and we have included them in our studies. Actually, we have now a project together with DFID, Doha Family Institute, and WISE, the World Summit for Education in Doha, and WISH, the World Summit for Health, exactly about that. It's exactly to see the two different perspectives between adolescents, the kids, and the parents. I mean, it's not a self-criticism for our panel, but all of us, we share the same view about adolescents, about children, how we treat them, how we deal with them, what is healthy for them. But no one of us talks actually, what do they want, you see? So we rarely listen to their point of view. And we rarely, I mean, listen whether they buy all the argument that we have about technology, stop using games, go to bed early, if you see, and all of that, with the phone off. We really don't hear to their point of view. So in this project that we have now, we will have the 2 points of view. We'll listen to the argument between the parents and the kids to see the points in favor and point against, and where the argument of parents is being convincing to kids. Because quite honestly, they really tell you what you want to hear, but doesn't mean they internalize the behavior. It doesn't mean they really, they have the workarounds and all of that. So that's one point we are studying now, the two perspectives there. But on the other hand, since we are talking about education, I think education about the media literacy, about the artificial intelligence, about the role of design, and all of that is really needed. Because what we are noticing now, the dialogue between parents and kids, and between parents themselves, is not really, I mean, sometimes it even lacks a terminology. So how to explain to kids, for example, this game is evil? They tell you why this game is evil. You need to be able to explain why this game is evil. You tell them, don't spend so much time on the phone. They tell you, I'm actually solving my homework with my friends on the phone. So back to the point of Francesca, that screen time is not anymore a valid measure, especially during the pandemic. Also, I have to say that in a recent study we haven't published yet, there is a weak correlation between screen time and the problematic internet usage. So we had the problematic internet usage scale on one hand, and we measured objectively the time they spent on the phone. On the other hand, they are actually correlated, but it's a weak one. So we need to look at whether they are correlated during, if kids using it during night hours, or they use games more, or they use social media more, and all of that. So back to the point, we need that literacy to enrich the dialogue between kids and parents, and that literacy is kind of missing, you see there. So that's my opinion about that.
Okay, thank you so much, Ryan, and I will go to Dina to also shift the discussion into another part related to familial relationships, which is intergenerational solidarity. You are leading one of the important research projects in Qatar related to well-being of elderly. And in fact, lockdown, social distancing, and the fear from infecting the ones we love, all these aspects together affected the physical connections between nuclear families and extended ones. Although physical connections were affected, yet digital spaces were utilized for connectivity. What's your take on that from the early findings of your research?
Actually, as you said, Mr. Ahmed, actually we are looking at basically the digital experience of the elderly and their caregiver in the Arab world and in Qatar in particular. So what we are looking at is actually came hand in hand with the pandemic and with actually the proposal we were writing that was granted luckily late last year. It was actually in the time of the pandemic, and there where we realized that one of the most vulnerable population during the pandemic, not only from a health perspective, but also from a digital perspective, are the elderly. And that's due not to their health reason, and in fact it's due to the designs not accommodating their needs, the designs of technologies. They've been always left out. And as we grow older, we start to become vulnerable toward technology. Why? Because technology usually assumes a specific basically measure of cognitive and physical motor. So it's expecting us to be very fast in clicking buttons. It's expecting us understanding information in a certain threshold. So usually this is not met in any technology design, even with the big tech giants. Usually these populations are not looked at. And the idea is basically how can we address the gap during the pandemic, as we all have known that technology has become in the peak of the pandemic, it became the only way for us to communicate with the world, to do our grocery, to talk to our loved ones, and so. So at that moment, many realized, and actually the ITU and the UN have released basically white papers and calls to look into the accessibility of technology for the elderly. Here in Qatar, we have the MEDA Assistive Technology Center, which is a collaborator in this project that you kindly highlighted, is also looking into basically, and it like almost 3 or 4 years ago, it developed what they call the best practices for the accessibility of the elderly. They work very actively with the community here, with the Ihsan Center, which is also a collaborator in this project, into basically looking into how can we raise the awareness of the importance of technologies for the elderly and for the caregiver. As we all have discussed in today's very rich discussion, usually the caregiver basically is put into stress because they are the channel where technology reaches the vulnerable group, whether it's children or the elderly. So looking at how can we facilitate the technologies for the caregiver and how can we support their task toward whether it's their loved one or whether they are employed caregiver. Here in the Arab world, we all know that usually, and actually many studies have highlighted that usually caregivers, the largest percentage of caregivers are family members. So those family members also has lives, has jobs. So how can I facilitate their caregiving task through technologies? And looking at technologies for the elderly, there is quite very little work, even in terms of the research. We are now actually conducting a scoping review, and what we are seeing that there is extremely little work, not only in this region in the world, in fact, in the entire world. Usually technology is, when designed, is not designed with them in mind. And that's something I would like to highlight in this session, is that there is scarce amount of research that we as a researcher could take the opportunity to address such an important gap. And as we all know, from the pandemic and to the next few years, we will rely very heavily on technology. So it is our opportunity to make life easier for everyone. And it's not only the academics, policymakers, leaders, individual centers, and even family members.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dina. And you ended your answer by, the role of policymakers and other stakeholders that could play in this regard. And the question is to you, Dr. Daisy. In this regard, how to better understand and address the social and economic impact of digital gaps in the family, as well as, because I know WFO are focusing on the social protection. So what role that social protection can play in mitigating the complex consequences and the challenges of COVID-19 pandemic in support for families?
Well, one thing for sure we can say that about the pandemic, about the coronavirus, we don't know much or maybe nothing yet. We don't know how this is proceeding. We don't know how this will, the evolution will be. We don't know what will work really to mitigate this virus. On the other hand, we are trying to visualize in the economic, in the social, and in the interrelationship inside the family, how the design have to be changed in order to cope with the consequences of this pandemic. I think that it's very important that governments, they need to realize that they have to change their behavior in order not only to mitigate the diseases, but to mitigate the economic and the social consequences of the disease. I found very, very interesting, as Mrs. Altani said, that her research and her institute, they are trying to design the technology in order to respond to the needs of the users, to know what they need to have in order to design the programs and the new technologies events. I was just thinking, how can we adapt this to the needs of the families? Especially talking about the gaps that we have not only in the digital access, but also the digital knowledge for accessing digital instruments to the benefit of the families. Of course, the relationship inside the house is not very equal in every family. We have families that are, since the marriage, decomposing the family, they are very happy and they are very supportive to the kids, and they have the community supporting, the caregivers, and so on. But we have also a lot of families that have no access to these facilities, and this makes this relationship very difficult inside the house. Can you imagine the consequences that the pandemic was bringing when a family is, let's say a poor family is with someone with the disease, someone lost the job, then the kids are not going to school, the woman is overburdened with a lot of her job, her family, more everybody at home. So technology is a very important tool, and this is our future. We cannot deny about that. But we have to think that, yes, we need to rethink how technology can grow, making the gap between the ones included and the ones not included can profit with the same opportunity. We know that A lot of jobs right now will be lost because they will not, because of technology, they will not be in demand. In the other hand, a lot of jobs will be lost because the person has no opportunity to upskill, to reskill for new demands that will definitely include technology. Kids are much more in a better position because, as I heard here, there are a lot of kids, very more than parents. They have a lot of access and knowledge about how to use technology. Let's think about the poor families in Africa, for instance. The kids have not to eat. The kids have imagination to make toys that they can mimic the toys that rich country have. So how we can reach with technology to these kids in order to put them in the equity that we talked about. We are just having a very big challenge between the disease, the family relationship, and how technology and the gap in technology we can think about in order to not to grow disparities, not to grow the digital divide, but how to include. We have posted a lot with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we see that exactly in the decade that we are thinking about accelerating the activities to reach the Sustainable Development Goal, we are in the middle of a pandemic that is putting everything behind. And here I wanted to mention that right now, the title of this webinar, fits a lot to the SDG 1, the poverty. We need to deal with that. The second, that is hunger. And the 12, the relationship between consumers and producers. Of course, thinking about the children, that is since conception, it's already underprivileged. And we need to give through technology, yes, and to access to technologies to them. Maybe we will really reach a better familial relationship if we could think about and also progress new means of technology to benefit the families.
Thank you so much, Daisy. And still, we are in the policy discussion. Before moving to the next questions, I would like to remind the audience, the participants, that you can post any questions or comments on the chat box or questions and answers section in the bottom of the screen. So I would like, to make use and utilizing having representatives from UNICEF and OECD. Both organizations are very much connected with governments and with NGOs, supporting them to develop policies and intervention programs. So my question is, how can governments and civil society use technology to deliver services and to enhance policies and programs and support families during the pandemic? Anna or Francesca, whom would like to start? Okay, you go ahead, Anna.
Thank you. So I'll jump in briefly. So yeah, I think that as you said, we like thinking about COVID as something that posed several challenges, but also multiple opportunities. We actually see for the first time in many, many decades that governments are very receptive to rethinking how they are delivering services to families and children. I think that many policymakers were in the same wagon as most of us, working from home, struggling with all the different stressors, and that created more understanding and shared empathy about the importance of supporting families, caregivers, and teachers. I think that a lot of professions and roles that were always kind of undervalued, for the first time really were more valuable and more prominent in the policy discourse. One of the things that we're doing in UNICEF is that we're taking the opportunity to help governments cost the new interventions that they actually piloted during the pandemic. As I mentioned, we had many countries like in Serbia where they really quickly pivoted to use home visits through telehealth, something that they never thought it was going to be possible. And they were able to do this effectively. And one of the good things that is happening is that the government is realizing that they actually can reach more families if they use telehealth services, just keeping the face-to-face interactions to the families that need additional support. So kind of a progressive universalism approach to service delivery. But I think one of the key opportunities that we have as UN agencies is then to help governments to start making sure that they understand the cost implications of these new service delivery platforms, how can they do it in an efficient way, and how they can sustain it after the crisis ends. Another thing that we are trying to capitalize on is the fact, as I mentioned, that the shadow crisis of mental health became very clear during the pandemic. And one of the things that we are seeing is that more governments are also receptive to find low-cost interventions that can promote the mental health of caregivers and children. And it's not just talking about treatment, but what can we do before we actually have an issue? And in UNICEF, we had the opportunity to work with 8 countries around the globe in a new approach called Caring for the Caregiver that actually tries to empower parents to address what are the sources of stress that they are dealing with, how they can actually have better skills to manage conflict within the families and within the community, and how can they also know what are the sources of support that they can actually use when they are struggling. And this point, I think, links to your previous question about the relationships and how they were affected during the crisis. So I think that if we start also working with governments to invest a bit more on preventative approaches and not just in treatment approaches, we're actually going to be able to leverage a lot of the learnings and the unfortunate facts that the crisis really exposed. Over to you.
Thank you, Anna. Over to you, Francesca.
I think that's a really, really great point that you just made, to advise governments to focus more on prevention than on treatment, and also taking a targeted approach to students in need. For example, to sort of touch on some of the questions earlier on relationships during the pandemic, what we saw, especially in a number of OECD countries, is that there were increased rates of domestic violence. And we know from our report that the OECD published, I think 2 years ago, on vulnerable children, that domestic violence is really correlated against violence against children, which is a very hard metric to measure. So I think taking a preventative approach and really targeting children who we know are in need is essential, whether that's physically or virtually. To answer the question, I would actually like to pivot a little bit and think about, this is what we work on a lot in my project at the OECD, is we think about how we can build capacity in education systems to meet the needs of children today. So we look at this through 2 angles. One is through forming strategic partnerships between education systems and other public sector actors, private sector actors, and civil society. So in 2018, we implemented a policy survey. We have responses from 26 different education systems. And we saw that in the majority of systems, partnerships are either required by mandate, by law, or are highly promoted between education systems and parents, almost universally. This is something that's very well established in many different education systems. Whereas when we look at partnerships between technology actors, so researchers studying digital technologies or industry, we see that this is really a less emphasized partnership in education systems. So in order to move forward and really capitalize on the positives and teaching children in a digital environment and teaching children with and about technology, it will be essential to form these partnerships to kind of fill the gaps, because education can't fill it all on its own. And another thing that's really, really important, especially as we move forward into a more digital, virtual learning environment, whatever happens as we progress through the pandemic, is really thinking about teacher education. How can education systems properly educate teachers in how to use digital technologies, how to teach with digital technologies, how to assess online risks to students. We know from our policy questionnaire that very few teacher education systems put an emphasis on learning about digital risks to students. There's quite a lot of emphasis on teaching with technology, but as we know from the Teaching and Learning International Survey, every single cycle, teachers report the highest level of need, first of all, for teaching students with special needs, but in second place, without fail, comes teaching with digital technologies, using technology in their teaching. So really, in terms of policy and sort of enhancing digital practices during COVID, during the pandemic, and as we move forward into this more digital future, it will really be essential to look at how we can build capacity in our systems through tapping into the different resources, tapping into teacher knowledge, partnering with different actors who have the capacity, who have the knowledge, who have the digital tools to effectively support education systems and to support teachers, to support parents, and to support children.
Thank you, Francesca, and let's go to the questions from audience. We have the first question from Dana Al-Kahlout. How can families themselves best use this time towards achieving cohesion and stability? So whom would you like to address this first? Daisy, I think you might be interested to start.
Actually, I was not interested in the second question, but I think we can put it together. And
sure.
This is something that we have discussed at WFO for a long time. Since we are an international organization that we gather together national governments as members, as NGOs, as academic, as university, as parliamentarian groups. And I think that we really have to shift, and this to my colleagues here of OCDE, also UNICEF, our experience, we have a little bit to shift from national governments to local governments. Actually, the family lives at local level. And there is a gap on time when programs and even financial support or consultancy comes to the national governments until they get to the local level. So even the United Nations is thinking right now to bring more local governments to participate with the work so we can really get better and faster to the families that lives at local level. So the second question here, this especially to new technologies, because if you are gonna in a real life take a look on families, especially in poor countries, they have no access to technology. So they have no programs. The schools are not equipped in order to teach technology or even to the teachers. If the companies, they don't have actually programs that can upskill the workers, because sooner or later, all companies will go to the new technology. So support to families in order to upgrade their life, the better understanding between the families, and not only the nuclear family, but the extended family, especially where the caregivers are also having their jobs and they need to accumulate everything. So the new technology could help a lot. We need to get to the local level. That is my observation on that.
Your take is very important, and from your take I go to Dr. Dina Al-Thani, because this is also related to the second question in relation to families in poverty and vulnerability, and the issue of access to technology is related also to your work on digital inequality when accessing the vital health information and maintaining daily activities online. So if you would give us some insights in this regard.
Sure, I actually agree very much with Daisy. Actually, it all starts in the community, and it then grows up. And I think a bottom up approach is usually a thing that we could look into, especially when it comes to digital inequality. So even technologies, you have. I've been fortunate to do a project where we developed an app which was supposed to be used by autistic adults, and this app was developed on an iOS platform. And with an assumption that it will be supported by all devices or all users. Let's say. So we did this study in Qatar and in another Arabic country. And what we faced in the other Arabic country, no one was using iOS from the participant who came to us. All of them was using different alternative devices that are cheaper actually. So it was actually, I would assume this is as us as a developer, we assume that everyone would have access to the best of the best technologies or the state-of-the-art technologies, but we should not assume this. So we should look into, and I would like to focus basically the importance of the awareness of the designers. The designer themselves being inclusive, and that's a project that myself and Dr. Rayan and Dr. Arim from HBKU is also looking into it, is how can we make the designers to be inclusive, to think beyond basically beyond their limits, and looking at the different parameters of inclusivity, from the economic to the disability to the education and all. So that's again going back to the point highlighted by all the panelists today, is basically being a user-centric, being a human-centric when designing for technologies. So that's my take on that.
Thank you, Dr. Dina. And we have important question from Renata, and Renata is the focal point on the family in the Division for Inclusive Social Development at TU Endesa. So the question is, do you see digital technologies fulfilling their potential towards greater social inclusion and intergenerational solidarity? What can be done beyond ensuring access? Maybe Dr. Rayan, if you have overview related to this question.
It's actually an extension to what Dina just said. Inclusiveness isn't only about accessibility. So accessibility means people are able to use the technology and able to achieve certain requirements or certain goals using it. Inclusiveness should be a bit more ambitious to include the well-being as well. So having a phone, a WhatsApp, and your manager is always texting you on WhatsApp. This is an accessible technology. It's very fine, it's very fast, but it's very distractive, you see, and it's so very detrimental to well-being. But I think when we speak about empathy and we speak about human-centered design, we need to go beyond the accessibility and beyond the usability. Most of these technology is actually very usable, and we are designing technologies really comfortable. But are we looking at well-being of people? So that's the extension of the project that Dr. Dina just mentioned about it. So we're looking beyond the accessibility and usability. We are looking at technology that contribute to our well-being in all our contexts, whether we have cognitive disability, whether we are in a bad mood, whether we have a socio-emotional state that we are weak in it. We still need the technologies that helps us. To give you an example, but that's also in the benefit of enterprises, cybersecurity behavior could also be influenced when you are using technology from home and within a context which is not very helping, when you are stressed, when you're not satisfied with life. So people are more likely to click on links and to do mistakes when they do that, costing the companies much money, basically. And that investment in people literacy and people resilience to technology isn't only luxury, but it can actually lead to an economic impact as well. So that's my take of it.
Thank you, Dr. Rayan. We have a question. Sorry, anyone wants to say anything related to this question? Okay, we have a question on social media to Francesca. Tiger parenting helps to have academic achievements for children. What are the negative consequences on the child well-being?
That's a very good question. And I'm actually not entirely sure. We did a little bit of research on this to look at some of the different parenting styles. So we were looking at helicopter parenting, tiger parenting. So I'm just going to pull up this information quickly because I know that we have it somewhere. We also, just for interest, if this research on parenting styles is interesting for members of the audience, we published a systematic review on different parenting styles and behaviors last year in 2020. And as you can imagine, it's sort of, you know, the answer is kind of obvious in terms of what kind of parenting styles tend to be more adaptive for children. And I mean, as we could have guessed, it turns out that warm, approachable parenting styles tend to be the most adaptive for children. But in terms of this question specifically, here we are. So for tiger parenting, so these results are correlational. So it's hard to kind of understand maybe what factors are also influencing some of these results, but just on a correlational level, tiger parenting in some of the literature has actually been correlated with a decrease in academic achievement, a decrease in student agency. So this means things like engagement and self-efficacy, an increase in academic stress, which that seems pretty self-explanatory. And then we've also seen that tiger parenting has sometimes been correlated positively with internalizing behaviors such as depression and anxiety. So it's really interesting to look at some of these trends because, for example, helicopter parenting and phubbing have also been correlated with different internalizing behaviors such as depression and anxiety. So if you need any one piece of advice, it would be that a warm, caring approach to parenting tends to be correlated with the best child outcomes, whereas some of these different styles that I presented, which are some of the less adaptive styles or behaviors, they could have negative repercussions.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's so clear. Another question to Anna. Parenting education programs usually face the lack of interest from parents to enroll in such programs. Is UNICEF using the virtual realities during pandemic to scale up parenting education program enrollment?
That is a very good question. And if I may, I would actually piggyback on one of the other questions in the chat from Dana about what to do when families don't have technology, as I thought that was a very relevant question. So I think here, as I mentioned, the crisis did bring a lot of opportunities. And one of the things that we used to say in UNICEF is that for a very long time, a lot of our approaches were about kind of bringing parents to us and trying to actually deal with some of those issues about maintaining parents interested in these programs. What the pandemic did is that for the first time, parents were coming to us to request information and knowledge and support. And I think that the governments felt the same pressure. So I think this opens a very good opportunity to actually build on that increased demand and actually meet that demand in the best way possible. And to the point that Dr. Althani was making, a lot of the programs that we were able to provide during the pandemic were actually built on what exists already at the community level. There were no parachuted models. We didn't go to Zambia and said, because we're doing this in the US, you should use this. It was the opposite. It was more about seeing what the community was already doing, what were the support structures in the community, and what were the innovations and technology that was most suitable for that context. So what we saw, for example, is in Zambia, all the outreach to parents happened through radio, because that is the mode of communication in that country. We saw in Kenya, for example, that the preferred mode of communication for parents was actually through SMS, through text messages. But we also saw that certain very vulnerable groups, like refugee communities, didn't have access to the SMS services. So some of our approaches were actually to see how we can get them the cards to access the digital access that they lacked. And the other thing that we saw is how to be most cost effective in the way that we provide these services. So we talk about add-on services. So for example, when you have a government that is spending billions of dollars, like many did during the pandemic, in social protection programs, for example, cash transfers. How can you leverage that cash transfer platform to also provide families with immediate support and information about how to deal with stress, but also how to promote learning at home? So we saw a lot of cash transfer programs actually providing learning kits for families, actually linking parents to other services, and at the same time, even providing some hygiene kits. So it's how can you be very flexible and adaptable and really hear what are the needs and the ecosystem on the ground to be most effective. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Anna. You made it very clear, and we have a suggestion from Philip in the chat box regarding digital inclusion in terms of social innovation. How about organizing an event of good practices and public policies so that people can help each other? And I think it's a very good suggestion. And we, as DeFi, can take this forward with other stakeholders. So we have 5 minutes left, and maybe one key message from every panelist. Maybe this key message could be in a format of recommendation, policy recommendation, or program intervention recommendation, because that's at the end what we care about after the whole discussion debate about research findings, in order to enhance the lives of families in this digital sphere that we are living at, and which exacerbated too many complications to families and also facilitated family lives during pandemic. So one recommendation, I will start, Dr. Daisy, please.
Well, my recommendation is that for sure we should rethink, rewrite our policies, our programs, our projects to focus in the local level and to bring the community more knowledgeable what are their role in cooperating with us. I like it very much the position of Anna that the pandemic brought us an opportunity. So this is the opportunity that we can rethink everything what we are doing and adapt to the virus, as the virus will not adapt to us. That is my recommendation.
Thank you, Dr. Ayan.
Well, I'm obviously biased toward research being an academic, but my recommendation is not to look at these things through the lenses of fast food. Like, we need a policy, we develop it very fast. No, there must be some research, there must be some evidence, and it's unlikely to be one size fits all anyway, because even the notion of family is not the same anyway. So we have done some research, having a family from Norway and family from Bangladesh, and we were talking about two different things. So inclusiveness also in that sense is needed, but we do not expect fast solution for these things. There must be some investment in research on that.
Investment in research is your recommendation then, and I think this should come on top of recommendations, because we don't build policy recommendations based on abstract thinking rather than building it on evidence. Dr. Dina Al-Thani?
I would like actually to echo my fellow panelists and just to stress on the point on human-centered research, especially when it comes to technology.
Very important.
It's not only about inclusion, it's about human-centered research. And actually, I will echo Dr. Rayan's basically recommendation in supporting human-centered research, and especially in the time of a pandemic. We've all noticed how important it is. So that's my message.
Francesca, then?
Thank you. My recommendation would be that governments, especially education systems, need to understand the importance for promoting lifelong learning in terms of digital skills to adequately equip parents, caregivers, teachers, people working in early childhood education and care to be able to effectively guide and moderate and mediate children's exposure and their engagement in the digital environment. And just, if I can slip in one other recommendation, I think that this is something that we've all understood now after over a year of this pandemic is that it's really important in this digital world, in this digital environment, to not forget the importance of our physicality. And one of my favorite quotes from an expert we've worked closely with is that a hug emoji is not the same as a hug. So at the end of the day, it's really important. The digital environment has so many opportunities for children, for us. Look at us joining each other from all corners of the globe. But at the end of the day, a hug emoji is not the same as a hug.
This is a very nice statement indeed. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would want to come back to a point that I made earlier about technology as a tool to amplify approaches that put caregivers and their relationship with their children at the center. So it's not replacing that interaction, but actually creating additional pathways for connection, information, and support to parents. And tagged to that is the importance of equity issues. The pandemic didn't affect all of us in the same way, and sadly we recognize that. So how can we actually use this as an opportunity to leverage technology to reach the most marginalized in a way that actually resonates with what is happening at the community level and subnational level in an adaptive manner? Thank you.
All the recommendations are to the point and from, to be honest, very distinguished and diversified the backgrounds from all of you panelists and from all the participants and the questions from the audience. We have some recommendations, and we have here Dr. Shifa Al-Amadi, the Executive Director, so whom might have the final say and the final remarks ending up this panel discussion.
Thank you, Ahmed. I can't agree more and I can't add more. It's really great discussion here all together. Thank you to all the panelists and the participants in this event. Really, this is our goal in DP, to take all these discussion and all these recommendations and build our new program for next year, to do more program relate to all these issues and to help all the families and to strengthen more work in strengthening family more. Thank you very much and happy International Family Day for all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Happy International Family Day. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Shifa and all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Thank you.